There's a particular stillness that settles over the small town of Millbrook, Vermont, just as evening begins to claim the day. It's the kind of quiet that wraps around you like your grandmother's quilt, soft and familiar, yet somehow holding secrets you've forgotten how to hear. In this gentle twilight hour, when porch lights flicker on like earthbound stars and the scent of wood smoke mingles with the last whispers of autumn, we begin to understand something profound about the weight we carry when we're always available to everyone but ourselves. Picture Sarah, a woman in her 40s who lives on Maple Street, her phone perpetually buzzing with messages from friends who need her wisdom, family members seeking her counsel, and colleagues who know she always say yes to one more project. Her house glows warmly from within, and if you were to peer through her kitchen window, you'd see her stirring soup with one hand while texting comfort to a heartbroken friend with the other. She moves through her evening ritual with practiced grace, yet there's something in her distant quality, like someone listening to a song only she can hear, a melody of exhaustion that plays on repeat. The weight of always being available isn't the kind you can measure on a scale or see reflected in a mirror. It's more like carrying water in your hands, invisible, essential, but constantly threatening to spill through your fingers. It accumulates in the spaces between breaths, in the pause before you answer your phone, in the split second when you consider, just for a moment, letting it ring. But you never do. The weight builds in layers, like sediment at the bottom of a quiet pond, until one day you realize you can barely remember what it felt like to move through the world unencumbered. In the Buddhist understanding, this weight has a name as the shadow side of compassion, the place where our genuine desire to alleviate suffering becomes entangled with our need to be needed, our fear of disappointing others, and our deep, often unconscious belief that our worth depends on our usefulness. Like a river that has forgotten its banks, our caring overflows its natural boundaries until we find ourselves drowning in the very love we sought to give. Consider the metaphor of the lighthouse keeper standing vigilant on rocky shores, guiding ships safely to harbor night after night. There's nobility in this calling, a sacred duty to be the beacon others depend upon. But imagine if the lighthouse keeper never left the tower, never descended the spiral stairs to rest, never trusted that the ocean could exist for a few hours without their watchful eye. Eventually, the oil would run out, the light would dim, and the very ships they sought to save would founder in darkness. This is what happens when we mistake constant availability for true service. We become lighthouses, burning through the night without ever replenishing our fuel, convincing ourselves that any moment of rest might result in someone's shipwreck. The irony is heartbreaking in our desperate attempt to prevent suffering. We create it within ourselves, and eventually, our dimmed light serves no one. Sarah discovers this truth on a Tuesday evening in October, when she realizes she's been awake since 3 a.m., helping a friend through a crisis via text, worked a full day, made dinner for her elderly neighbor, and now sits in her kitchen at 11 p.m., eyes burning as she scrolls through 17 more messages requesting her attention. Her reflection in the darkened window looks like a stranger someone she might have helped years ago but now barely recognizes. The weight reveals itself in the small moments of everyday life. It's in the way you hesitate before opening your laptop, knowing it's full of requests you can't ignore. It's in the tightness in your chest when you hear your phone notification sound, even when you're supposed to be relaxing. It's in the way you've started scheduling your own needs around everyone else's emergencies, until you can't remember the last time you did something simply because it brought you joy. But perhaps most telling is how this weight affects your dreams. Instead of the deep, restorative sleep that heals both body and spirit, you find yourself in a strange liminal space, half sleeping and half listening, always partially alert for the next call for help. Your unconscious mind, like a devoted guard dog, never fully relaxes, never trusts that the world can exist without your vigilant care. What would it mean, we might gently ask ourselves, to set down this weight for just a moment? Not to abandon our compassion or turn away from those who need us, but simply to acknowledge that we, too, are worthy of care. The Buddhist teacher, Pema Chödrön, speaks of loving kindness as a practice that begins with ourselves, not from selfishness, but from wisdom. How can we offer genuine nourishment to others when our own well has run dry? In the soft darkness of Sarah's kitchen, something shifts. She looks at her phone with its 17 unopened messages and makes a radical choice. She turns it off. Not forever, not in anger or resentment, but with the same gentle kindness she shows everyone else. She makes herself a cup of chamomile tea, sits in her favorite chair by the window, and for the first time in months, simply breathes. The world doesn't end when we step away from our post as the perpetually available helper. The sun still rises over the green mountains, the maple trees still whisper their ancient songs. And somehow, mysteriously, the people who depend on us find ways to navigate their challenges. This isn't abandonment, it's trust. Trust in the resilience of others, trust in the natural order of things, and most importantly, trust in our own worthiness to rest. As we settle into this exploration together, allow yourself to feel the weight you've been carrying, not to judge it or push it away, but simply to acknowledge its presence with the same compassion you would show a weary traveler. What if this weight isn't a badge of honor, but an invitation to deeper wisdom? What if learning to rest isn't selfish, but sacred? Tonight, as the stars emerge over Vermont's gentle hills, we begin to understand that true service flows not from exhaustion, but from fullness. Not from depletion, but from a well that has been tenderly maintained and lovingly refilled. The art of recognizing this weight requires a special kind of attention, the same gentle awareness we might bring to watching snow fall on a winter morning. Each flake appears weightless, insignificant, yet together they can bend mighty branches and transform the entire landscape. Our accumulated acts of service, each seemingly small agreement to help, each yes when our spirit whispers rest, creates a similar transformation in our inner landscape. Think of Emily, a counselor who lives 3 towns over from Sarah, who has built her entire identity around being available to her clients, her family, her community. She prides herself on never missing a call, never turning away someone in need, never saying the word no when it comes to service. But lately, she's noticed something troubling. The very qualities that made her an exceptional helper are beginning to feel hollow. Her empathy feels forced, her wisdom sounds rehearsed, and her trademark warmth has become a mask she puts on each morning like makeup. The weight of always being available creates a peculiar kind of isolation. Surrounded by people who need us, we can feel profoundly alone, because we've forgotten how to be with ourselves, without an agenda, without someone else's crisis to solve or pain to soothe. We become strangers to our own rhythms, deaf to our own needs, blind to our own seasons of growth and rest. In this gentle recognition lies the beginning of freedom, not the freedom to abandon our calling to serve, but the freedom to serve from a place of wholeness rather than depletion, presence rather than pressure, love rather than obligation. The lighthouse doesn't apologize for needing fuel. The river doesn't feel guilty for returning to the ocean to be replenished. What stories have you been telling yourself about rest? What fears arise when you imagine setting boundaries around your availability? These questions aren't meant to be answered quickly or easily, but to be held like precious seeds, planted in the fertile soil of your growing awareness and allowed to sprout in their own perfect timing. The morning light filters through the lace curtains of Grace's kitchen in Portland, Maine, where she sits with her second cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to triage human need before her own feet touch the floor. 3 text messages from her sister about their mother's health, an email from a colleague asking her to cover an extra shift, and a voicemail from her neighbor whose car won't start. It's 6:47 a.m. and Grace has already mentally committed to solving problems that aren't technically hers to solve. This is where compassion begins its subtle transformation into something else entirely. Compulsion that wears the mask of virtue but carries the weight of addiction. Like a moth drawn to flame, Grace finds herself pulled toward every flicker of need, every signal of distress, unable to distinguish between genuine calling and the deeper hunger that drives her to be indispensable. Consider the ancient story of the medicine woman who lived at the edge of a vast forest. People traveled from distant villages to seek her healing touch, her wisdom, her miraculous remedies. She gave freely, generously, never turning anyone away. But as her reputation grew, so did the demands upon her time and energy. Soon, she was seeing patients from dawn until well past midnight, barely pausing to eat or rest. The medicine woman told herself this was her sacred duty, her spiritual practice, her contribution to alleviating the world's suffering. One morning, she woke to find that her garden, the source of all her healing herbs, had withered. In her devotion to helping others, she had forgotten to tend the very earth that made her service possible. The irony was both heartbreaking and illuminating. In her compulsion to heal everyone else, she had allowed the source of her healing power to die. This is the paradox that many compassionate souls face without recognizing it. The line between genuine service and compulsive helping is often invisible, drawn not in dramatic moments but in the accumulation of tiny choices, barely conscious decisions to prioritize everyone else's well-being over our own. We tell ourselves we're being selfless, but beneath the surface, more complex motivations weave their threads through our actions. Grace recognizes this pattern in herself during a quiet moment on her lunch break. Sitting on a bench outside the community center where she volunteers twice a week, she's just finished mediating a conflict between 2 board members, rescheduled her own therapy appointment to accommodate someone else's emergency, and committed to organizing the holiday fundraiser because, as she puts it, someone has to do it. But as she sits there in the October sunshine, a question surfaces that she's been avoiding for months. When did helping others stop feeling like a choice and start feeling like a necessity? The Buddhist concept of attachment reveals itself in unexpected places. We typically think of attachment in terms of material desires, clinging to possessions, outcomes, or relationships. But there's a subtler form of attachment that can ensnare even the most spiritually minded among us. Attachment to being the helper, to being needed, to maintaining the identity of someone who never says no. This attachment is particularly insidious because it masquerades as virtue, making it nearly impossible to recognize until we're already caught in its web. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future chapters, and share in the comments how you're feeling. Your journey toward recognizing these patterns is part of a larger awakening that connects us all. The transformation from compassion to compulsion happens gradually, like the way a path through the woods becomes worn deeper with each passing traveler. At first, our desire to help springs from genuine empathy. We see suffering and naturally want to alleviate it. But over time, if we're not mindful, other motivations begin to intermingle with our pure intention. The gratitude in someone's eyes becomes addictive. The feeling of being essential becomes intoxicating. The role of savior becomes our primary identity. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a therapist who works with healthcare professionals experiencing burnout, explains it this way. We start helping because we care, but sometimes we continue helping because we're afraid of who we might be if we're not helping. The helping becomes less about the other person and more about maintaining our sense of self-worth. This insight cuts to the heart of the matter when our identity becomes so entangled with our service that we can't imagine existing without it. We've crossed the line from compassion into compulsion. The signs of this shift are often subtle. You might notice that you feel anxious when you're not actively helping someone. You might find yourself looking for problems to solve, even when none exist. You might discover that your mood depends heavily on other people's gratitude and approval. These aren't character flaws. They're human responses to a culture that often rewards self-sacrifice and teaches us to equate our worth with our productivity and usefulness. In Grace's case, the realization comes through her body's wisdom. Sitting on that bench, she notices that her shoulders are permanently raised, as if she's been bracing for the next crisis for so long that relaxation has become foreign to her muscles. Her jaw aches from a tension she wasn't even aware she was carrying. These physical signals are her body's way of communicating what her mind has been too busy to notice. The helping has become a burden that she's carrying, not just emotionally, but in her very bones. The path back to authentic compassion requires what Buddhist teachers call right intention. The practice of examining our motivations with honest gentleness. This doesn't mean we stop helping. It means we become curious about why we help. Are we responding to genuine need, or are we feeding our own need to be needed? Are we offering our gifts from a place of fullness, or are we desperately trying to prove our worth through endless service? Grace begins this inquiry by asking herself a simple but profound question. What would happen if I weren't available to help everyone who asks? The initial response is predictable anxiety, guilt, images of people suffering because she wasn't there to intervene. But as she sits with the question longer, breathing deeply and allowing space for other possibilities to emerge, she realizes something surprising. Her absence might actually create space for others to discover their own strength, their own resources, their own capacity to solve problems and support each other. This isn't an abandonment of compassion, it's a maturation of it. True compassion trusts in the resilience and capability of others. It offers support without creating dependency. It gives help without taking away the gift of self-reliance. When we help from compulsion rather than genuine care, we often rob others of the opportunity to develop their own muscles of resilience and problem-solving. The autumn wind rustles through the maple trees as Grace makes a decision that feels both terrifying and liberating. She will begin to pause before saying yes. She will create a small space between request and response, allowing herself to feel into whether her help is truly needed or if she's simply responding to the familiar pull of being indispensable. This pause isn't selfish, it's sacred. It's the breath between notes that makes music possible, the silence between words that gives them meaning. What compulsions have wrapped themselves around your compassion? What roles have you adopted that feel more like prison than purpose? These questions aren't meant to shame, but to illuminate, not to judge, but to free. Recognition is the first step toward liberation, and liberation is what allows us to serve from our truest, most sustainable place. As the afternoon light slants through Grace's kitchen window, she practices something revolutionary, doing nothing. Just for 15 minutes, she sits in her chair and breathes, not solving anyone's problems, not answering any calls for help, simply being present with herself. It feels strange at first, almost guilty, but gradually something settles in her chest, a recognition of her own worthiness to exist, without constantly earning her place through service. In the pre-dawn darkness of her small apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, Maya sits cross-legged on her meditation cushion, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a world beginning to stir. Distant traffic, the soft hum of her neighbor's coffee maker, the gentle percussion of rain against her window. But instead of finding the peace she seeks in these quiet moments, her mind churns with a familiar refrain. She should be doing more, helping more, giving more. Even here, in this sacred space meant for inner stillness, the myth of selfless service whispers its seductive lies. This myth runs so deep in our collective consciousness that questioning it feels almost blasphemous. We've been taught that good people sacrifice themselves for others, that spiritual people transcend their own needs, that true service means complete self-abnegation. The very phrase selfless service carries within it a fundamental misunderstanding, the belief that caring for ourselves somehow diminishes our capacity to care for others, that self-preservation is inherently selfish. But what if this entire framework is built on quicksand? What if the most radical act of service is learning to include ourselves in the circle of our compassion? Consider the flight attendant's instruction that has become a metaphor for wisdom. In case of emergency, put your own oxygen mask on first before helping others. This isn't selfishness, it's physics. An unconscious person cannot assist anyone. Yet somehow, when we transfer this logic to emotional and spiritual realms, we resist it. We believe that caring for our own needs makes us less pure, less dedicated, less worthy of respect. Maya has been wrestling with this contradiction for months. As a social worker specializing in trauma recovery, she's built her career on helping others heal from their deepest wounds. She's good at it, exceptionally good. Her clients trust her, her colleagues rely on her expertise, and she's developed a reputation as someone who never gives up on the most challenging cases. But lately, she's begun to notice something troubling. She gives her clients permission to rest, to take time for self-care, to prioritize their healing, while denying herself these same basic needs. The hypocrisy becomes clear one Tuesday afternoon when she's counseling Rebecca, a nurse who's experiencing burnout. "You can't pour from an empty cup," Maya tells her gently, her voice full of compassion and professional wisdom. "Taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's essential. How can you truly help others if you're depleted?" Rebecca nods, tears of recognition in her eyes, finally understanding that her exhaustion isn't a sign of weakness, but a call for attention. Later that evening, Maya sits in her car in the parking lot of her office building, too tired to drive home, and realizes she's been giving advice she doesn't follow. She's the empty cup, trying desperately to pour. She's the depleted well, somehow expecting to continue nourishing others. The wisdom she dispenses so freely to her clients feels foreign when applied to her own life, as if there are different rules for helpers and the helped, different standards for those who serve and those who receive. This double standard reveals something profound about how we've been conditioned to think about worthiness. Somewhere along the way, many of us absorbed the message that we earn love through usefulness, that our value lies not in our inherent being, but in our constant doing. The myth of selfless service becomes a trap that keeps us performing worthiness rather than simply embodying it. In the Buddhist tradition, this trap has a name: the hungry ghost realm. Hungry ghosts are depicted as beings with enormous appetites but tiny mouths, forever consuming but never satisfied. When we operate from the myth of selfless service, we become hungry ghosts of a different sort, desperately, consuming other people's gratitude and recognition to feed a sense of worth that can never be filled from the outside. Maya's awakening begins with a simple but revolutionary recognition. She is not separate from the web of beings deserving compassion. If she wouldn't expect her clients to work 60-hour weeks without rest, to skip meals while caring for others, to ignore their own emotional needs while tending everyone else's, why does she expect this of herself? The question hangs in the air of her small apartment like morning mist, gradually revealing the landscape of her assumptions. The myth of selfless service often masks a deeper fear, the terror of being ordinary, of being just another person with needs and limitations, rather than a superhuman helper who transcends such mundane concerns. There's a secret grandiosity in believing we must sacrifice ourselves completely for others, a subtle form of spiritual pride that says, "I am so essential, so indispensable, that the normal rules of human need don't apply to me." But true humility lies in the opposite direction. It lies in acknowledging that we are part of the interconnected web of life, not above it or separate from it. It lies in recognizing that our needs matter not because we're special, but because all needs matter. It lies in understanding that self-care isn't selfish, it's an act of radical equality, a declaration that we deserve the same compassion we offer others. Maya begins practicing this radical equality on a small scale. When she feels hungry during a long day of sessions, instead of pushing through and eating later, she takes a few minutes to nourish herself. When exhaustion tugs at her consciousness, instead of reaching for another cup of coffee, she allows herself a brief rest. These tiny acts feel enormous at first, weighted with guilt and the fear that she's being indulgent. But gradually, something shifts. She notices that her presence with clients becomes more authentic when she's not running on empty. Her listening becomes deeper when she's not distracted by her own unmet needs. Her compassion flows more freely when it's not filtered through resentment at her own self-neglect. The quality of her service actually improves when she stops trying to be selfless and starts being whole. This isn't about becoming selfish or self-absorbed. It's about expanding our definition of the self we're serving. When we truly understand interdependence, the Buddhist principle that all beings are connected, we see that caring for ourselves is caring for others. Our well-being ripples outward, affecting everyone we encounter. Our depletion does the same. Think of it as tending a garden. A gardener who never rests, never eats, never takes time to restore their own energy might work very hard, but eventually their exhaustion will show in their work. The plants they tend with, shaking hands and blurred vision, won't thrive the way they would under the care of someone who is rested, nourished, and present. The garden itself suffers when the gardener forgets they are part of the ecosystem they're tending. Maya's practice of including herself in her circle of compassion begins to transform her relationships, both professional and personal. Friends start commenting that she seems more present, more genuinely available rather than frantically accommodating. Her clients sense a shift in their sessions. She's still deeply caring, but there's a groundedness to her presence that wasn't there when she was running on fumes and good intentions. Most surprisingly, her capacity for service actually expands. When she's no longer depleted, she has more genuine energy to offer. When she's not resentful about her own unmet needs, she can give more freely. When she's not performing worthiness through endless sacrifice, she can serve from authenticity rather than desperation. The rain has stopped, and morning light begins to filter through Maya's apartment windows. She sits on her cushion, no longer fighting the voices that tell her to do more, be more, give more. Instead, she listens to them with the same compassionate attention she would give a frightened child, acknowledging their concern while gently holding firm to a deeper truth. She is already enough, exactly as she is, needs and limitations included. What myths about service have you been carrying? What beliefs about worthiness keep you trapped in the endless cycle of doing rather than being? These questions aren't meant to dismantle your compassion, but to purify it, not to stop your service, but to make it sustainable. As the day dawns bright over the Blue Ridge Mountains, Maya makes herself a proper breakfast and eats it slowly, tasting each bite as if it were medicine. Because it is medicine, the medicine of treating herself with the same care she so freely gives to others. This simple act isn't selfish, it's sacred. It's a quiet revolution, a gentle dismantling of the myth that has kept so many good people burning themselves out in service to an impossible ideal. The word no sits on Rachel's tongue like a foreign language she's never learned to speak fluently. Standing in the doorway of her home office in Burlington, Vermont, phone in hand, she listens to her friend Janet explain why she desperately needs Rachel to organize the neighborhood winter festival again. "You're just so good at this," Janet says, her voice carrying that particular tone of helplessness that Rachel has learned to recognize as manipulation disguised as flattery. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Rachel's chest tightens. She can feel the familiar pattern beginning, the automatic yes forming in her throat, the mental reshuffling of her already overcrowded schedule. the familiar weight of another obligation settling onto her shoulders. Like a heavy coat she can't seem to take off. But something different happens this time. Instead of speaking immediately, she pauses. In that small space between Janet's request and her response, she feels something she hasn't experienced in years: choice. Sacred boundaries are not walls built to keep others out. They are gardens walls, built to keep what matters most safe and tended. They are the loving limits that allow our deepest gifts to flourish, rather than scatter like seeds on rocky ground. Yet for those of us trained in perpetual availability, boundaries feel not like protection, but like betrayal, not like self-care, but like selfishness. Consider the story of the monastery garden, where each plant is given exactly the space it needs to grow. The gardener doesn't apologize for separating the mint from the basil. They understand that without boundaries, the mint would overrun everything, choking out the diversity that makes the garden beautiful. The boundaries aren't punishment for the mint. They're recognition of its nature and respect for all the other plants that deserve their place in the sun. This is what Rachel begins to understand as she stands in her doorway, feeling the weight of Janet's expectation pressing against something newly awakened in her chest. The recognition that her time, energy, and attention are not unlimited resources to be distributed without discernment, but precious gifts that deserve thoughtful stewardship. "Let me think about it and get back to you," Rachel hears herself saying, the words emerging from some deeper place of wisdom she didn't know she possessed. The silence on the other end of the line is palpable. Janet is clearly unprepared for anything other than immediate agreement. "I'll call you tomorrow," Rachel adds gently, and hangs up. The immediate aftermath of setting even this small boundary is intense. Guilt rises in her throat like bile. Her mind floods with justifications for why she should call Janet back immediately and agree to take on the festival. She imagines Janet telling others that Rachel has become selfish, unreliable, difficult. She pictures the festival falling apart because she wasn't there to organize it, children disappointed, community connections severed. The catastrophic thinking spirals quickly, each imagined consequence more dramatic than the last. But beneath the familiar storm of guilt and anxiety, something else stirs a tiny seed of relief. For the first time in months, Rachel has created a small space around her decision-making, a brief pause that allows her to consider what she actually wants, rather than simply responding to what others need from her. It's a revolutionary act, this pause, though it feels more like rebellion than wisdom. The Buddhist concept of loving kindness extends far beyond being nice to people or accommodating their requests. True loving kindness includes the wisdom to discern when saying yes serves the highest good, and when saying no is the more compassionate response. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone is to allow them to develop their own capacity to solve problems, organize events, or navigate challenges. When we always step in to rescue others from discomfort or responsibility, we rob them of the opportunity to grow. Rachel discovers this truth through her relationship with her teenage daughter, Emma, who has grown accustomed to her mother solving every problem, handling every detail, smoothing every rough edge. When Emma forgets her lunch for the third time in a week and calls Rachel to bring it to school, Rachel faces a choice: rush across town to deliver the forgotten meal, or allow Emma to experience the natural consequence of her forgetfulness, The old Rachel would have dropped everything and driven to the school, probably stopping at Emma's favorite sandwich shop along the way to make up for her daughter's disappointment. But this new version of Rachel, still tentative but growing stronger, takes a breath and says, "I'm sorry you forgot your lunch, sweetheart. The cafeteria has options, and I know you'll remember tomorrow." Emma's shock is audible through the phone. "But Mum, you always..." "I know," Rachel interrupts gently, "but I think you're capable of handling this." The guilt is immediate and intense. Rachel spends the rest of the morning imagining Emma hungry and betrayed, convinced that her mother no longer cares. But when Emma comes home that afternoon, something surprising happens. "Actually, Mum," she says, dumping her backpack by the door, "the cafeteria pizza was pretty good, and Sarah shared her chips with me. I met this new girl Maya while we were in Lineshay, just moved here from Colorado." Rachel realizes that by not rushing to solve Emma's problem, she created space for her daughter to have new experiences, make new connections, and build confidence in her own ability to navigate challenges. This is the paradox of sacred boundaries. What feels like withholding love often creates more space for love to flourish naturally. When we stop trying to prevent everyone from experiencing discomfort, we allow them to develop their own resources for resilience. When we stop saying yes to everything, our yes becomes more meaningful. When we stop being available for every request, our presence becomes more precious. The practice of boundary setting requires a fundamental shift in how we define caring. We've been conditioned to believe that caring means availability, that love means accommodation, that kindness requires self-sacrifice. But true caring sometimes looks like disappointing someone in the short term to serve their long-term growth. True love sometimes means allowing discomfort rather than rushing to eliminate it. True kindness sometimes requires us to trust others' capacity to handle their own challenges. Rachel begins practicing this new form of caring in small ways. When her neighbor asks her to water plants during a weekend trip, instead of automatically agreeing, she checks her own schedule and energy levels first. She discovers she has plans for a quiet weekend at home the first. She's had in months and realizes that saying yes to the plant watering would mean saying no to her own need for rest. "I'm not available this weekend," she tells her neighbor, "but I bet the teenager down the street would appreciate earning some money for plant sitting." The neighbor's response is surprisingly positive. "Oh, what a good idea. I should have thought of that myself. Thanks for the suggestion." Rachel realizes that her automatic yes had actually been preventing others from finding creative solutions and developing their own support networks. Her boundary hadn't caused harm, it had created space for new connections and possibilities. As autumn deepens in Vermont, Rachel begins to understand that boundaries aren't barriers to connection, but foundations for authentic relationship. When she shows up as herself, complete with needs, limitations, and preferences, then as the infinitely accommodating helper she thought people needed her to be, her relationships actually deepen. Friends begin confiding in her about their own struggles with boundaries. Family members start asking for her opinion rather than just her help. Colleagues begin seeing her as a person rather than just a resource. The most profound shift comes in her relationship with herself. As Rachel practices the radical act of including her own needs in her decision-making process, she begins to rediscover parts of herself that had been buried under years of accommodation. She remembers that she loves to paint, something she gave up when helping others became a full-time occupation. She recalls her passion for hiking, abandoned when weekends became consumed with other people's projects and crises. One Saturday morning, instead of organizing someone else's event or solving someone else's problem, Rachel drives to her favorite trail in the Green Mountains. As she walks among the maples and birches, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the grey November sky, she feels something she hasn't experienced in years. Spaciousness, not the empty space of loneliness, but the fertile space of possibility, the breathing room that allows new growth to emerge. What would it feel like to treat your time as sacred? What would change if you approached your energy as a precious resource, worthy of thoughtful allocation? These questions aren't meant to make you selfish, but to help you become more intentionally generous. Not to close your heart, but to help you love more wisely. As the sun begins to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Rachel understands that saying no to what doesn't serve allows us to say yes to what does. Boundaries aren't walls that separate us from love, they're the fertile soil in which authentic love grows, the container that allows our truest gifts to flourish and be shared from a place of fullness rather than depletion. In the high desert of New Mexico, where ancient mesas rise like sleeping giants against an endless sky, Brother Thomas walks the worn paths between the adobe buildings of the monastery where he has served for 15 years. The pre-dawn air carries the scent of sage and the promise of another day devoted to prayer, work, and service to the small community that has grown around this sacred place. But this morning, something feels different. As he approaches the chapel for morning prayers, his feet slow, then stop entirely. For the first time in over a decade, Brother Thomas cannot bring himself to open the heavy wooden door. This moment of unexpected hesitation opens a window into one of the most profound paradoxes of spiritual life, the necessity of holy emptiness, the sacred rest that even the most devoted servants require. In the Buddhist tradition, this is understood as the wisdom of skillful means, knowing when to engage and when to retreat, when to pour forth and when to draw back into the silence that replenishes all action. Brother Thomas settles onto a simple wooden bench outside the chapel, watching the sun paint the desert landscape in shades of amber and rose. He has dedicated his life to being available to God in prayer, available to his community in service, available to the pilgrims who come seeking guidance and solace. The rhythm of availability has become so ingrained in his being that this sudden inability to participate feels like betrayal, like spiritual failure. But as he sits in the gathering light, breathing in the vast stillness of the desert morning, he begins to sense something else, an invitation to a different kind of service, the service of simply being present to emptiness. The Bodhisattva ideal, often misunderstood in Western spiritual circles, includes within it the wisdom of strategic withdrawal. The true Bodhisattva knows that sustainable compassion requires periods of retreat, moments of turning inward, not from selfishness, but from the deep recognition that even infinite love needs finite vessels, and finite vessels need time to be renewed. Consider the metaphor of the bell that rang in the monastery courtyard each morning, calling the community to prayer. For years, This bell sang with clear, resonant tones that could be heard for miles across the desert. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the bell's voice began to change. The ring became less clear, the resonance less pure. The bellkeeper, an old monk named Father Miguel, noticed the change long before others did. Instead of forcing the bell to ring louder or more frequently, he made a counterintuitive decision. He gave the bell a season of silence. Even metal needs to rest, he explained to the younger monks who questioned this departure from routine. The bell has served faithfully for decades. Now it needs time to settle into itself, to remember its true voice. For 3 months, the community woke without the familiar call to prayer, learning to listen instead for the subtler rhythms of their own hearts and the natural sounds of the desert awakening. When Father Miguel finally rang the bell again at the end of its rest period, the sound that emerged was transformed, clearer, deeper, more resonant than it had been in years. The bell had not forgotten how to ring. It had remembered how to be truly bell-like in its essence. Brother Thomas understands this story differently now, sitting in the morning light with his own voice temporarily silent. He has been the bell, ringing faithfully day after day, year after year, until the clarity of his service began to blur into mechanical repetition. His prayers had become routine rather than communion, his presence more obligation than gift. The inability to open the chapel door isn't spiritual failure, it's spiritual wisdom, his deeper self calling for the kind of rest that restores authenticity to action. In our culture of constant productivity, the idea of holy rest can feel almost sacrilegious. We've been conditioned to equate busyness with virtue, activity with spirituality, constant availability with love. But the mystics of all traditions understand something we have largely forgotten, that the deepest service sometimes emerges from the deepest stillness, that the most profound offering we can make is our authentic presence rather than our endless activity. Brother Thomas recalls a conversation he had years ago with an elderly Zen master who visited the monastery. "What is the most important part of the bowl?" the master had asked, holding up a simple ceramic vessel. Brother Thomas had answered as he thought appropriate: "The clay, shaped by the potter's hands." The master smiled gently and shook his head. "The most important part of the bowl is the emptiness inside. Without the emptiness, it cannot hold anything. Without the space, it cannot serve." This teaching takes on new meaning as Brother Thomas sits in his unexpected Sabbath. He has been so focused on being the shaped, clay-strong, useful, reliable, that he has forgotten to tend the emptiness within, the sacred space that allows him to hold others' pain, joy, and seeking with genuine presence rather than automatic response. The desert around him pulses with its own rhythm of emptiness and fullness. The vast spaces between the scattered junipers aren't empty, they're full of potential, alive with possibility. The silence between one bird's call and the next isn't absence, it's the pause that gives meaning to the song. The apparent emptiness of the landscape isn't barren, it's spacious enough to hold the endless sky. As the morning progresses and the community gathers for prayers without him, Brother Thomas expects to feel guilt, anxiety, the familiar push to rejoin the familiar patterns. Instead, he feels something he hasn't experienced in years: deep settling, a return to a center he hadn't realized he had lost. His breathing naturally slows and deepens. His shoulders, perpetually raised in the posture of someone ready to serve, finally relax. His mind, usually racing ahead to the next prayer, the next task, the next person who might need his attention, finally comes to rest in the present moment. This rest isn't laziness or spiritual bypassing, it's the profound discipline of allowing ourselves to be replenished by the source from which all authentic service flows. In the Christian contemplative tradition, this is called kenosis, the self-emptying that creates space for divine fullness. In Buddhism, it's niyat, the emptiness that is not void but pregnant with infinite possibility. Brother Thomas realizes that his years of constant service, while well intentioned, had gradually separated him from the wellspring of compassion that had originally called him to this life. He had been offering people his own limited resources, his willpower, his accumulated wisdom, his practiced responses, rather than creating space for something larger to move through him. His service had become about him serving rather than allowing service to emerge through him. The sun climbs higher, and the desert begins to shimmer with heat. Brother Thomas finds himself entering a state he remembers from his early years of practice, but had somehow lost along the way, a quality of alert receptivity, of being present without agenda, of offering his attention to the moment without trying to fix, improve, or direct it. This is the Bodhisattva's secret rest. Not the absence of engagement, but the presence of non-attachment. Not withdrawal from compassion, but freedom from the compulsion to constantly act upon it. A lizard emerges from behind a rock near his bench, moving with the unhurried precision of a creature perfectly attuned to its own rhythms. Brother Thomas watches without trying to extract any meaning or lesson from the encounter, simply allowing himself to witness the lizard's perfect presence to its own lizardness. In this simple observation, he glimpses what his own service might look like when it emerges from this place of empty fullness rather than anxious availability. When he finally rises from the bench as the sun reaches its zenith, Brother Thomas moves differently than he has in years. His steps are slower but somehow more purposeful, his attention more spacious but paradoxically more focused. He doesn't rush to make up for his missed morning prayers or apologize for his absence. Instead, he simply continues with his day from this new place of centeredness, carrying the desert's teaching of fertile emptiness into each interaction, each task, each moment of service. What would it mean to give yourself permission to rest, not as retreat from your calling, but as return to its source? What sacred emptiness have you been afraid to enter, mistaking it for abandonment rather than renewal? These questions aren't invitations to spiritual escapism, but to the kind of deep rest that makes authentic engagement possible. As evening falls over the high desert, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange and purple, Brother Thomas understands that the Bodhisattva's secret rest isn't about stopping service, but about serving from emptiness rather than ego, from space rather than compulsion, from the infinite wellspring of compassion rather than the finite resources of personal will. Dr. Lisa Chen sits in her Honda Civic in the employee parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital in Minneapolis. Engine off, winter coat still zipped to her chin despite the car's warmth. It's 11:47 p.m. and she's been here for 3 minutes, unable to summon the energy to walk the 30 yards to her apartment building. Her body feels like lead, heavy and unresponsive, as if gravity has suddenly doubled its pull on her bones. This is the 3rd time this week she's sat like this. caught between the exhaustion of a 14-hour shift and the strange inability to transition from work mode to rest mode, as if some essential part of her has forgotten how to simply be human. The exhaustion Dr. Chen carries isn't the clean tiredness that comes after a good day's work, the satisfying fatigue that sleep can cure. This is something deeper, more complexer, weariness that has seeped into her cells, a tiredness that no amount of rest seems to touch. It's the accumulated weight of carrying other people's pain while ignoring her own, of being strong for everyone else while her own foundation slowly crumbles beneath the surface of professional competence. In the emergency department where Dr. Chen works, listening to the body's signals is literally a matter of life and death. A racing pulse, a drop in blood pressure, an irregular heartbeat. These are messages that demand immediate attention, sophisticated interpretation, swift response. Yet when it comes to her own body's increasingly urgent communications, Dr. Chen has become selectively deaf, dismissing her own symptoms as weakness, inconvenience, or simply the price of caring for others. Consider the wisdom embedded in pain itself, that sharp, insistent voice that cuts through all our mental justifications and demands attention. When we touch a hot stove, we don't deliberate about whether withdrawing our hand is selfish or consider the stove's feelings. We respond immediately, instinctively, honoring the body's wisdom that pain is information, that discomfort is often protection, that our physical being has its own intelligence that operates beyond the reach of our mental constructs about duty and service. But emotional exhaustion, spiritual depletion, and the more subtle forms of burnout don't announce themselves with the clarity of physical pain. They whisper before they scream, speak in the language of irritability, insomnia, and a growing sense of disconnection from the work that once felt like calling. They show up as the inability to feel genuinely present with patients, the mechanical going through motions that replaces authentic engagement. The way Dr. Chen finds herself offering comfort to families while feeling completely empty inside. Sitting in her car, Dr. Chen begins to notice what she's been too busy to acknowledge. Her shoulders have been permanently raised for months, creating a constant ache in her neck that she's learned to ignore. Her jaw clenches unconsciously, especially during difficult cases, leaving her with headaches that she treats with ibuprofen and caffeine rather than addressing their source. Her sleep has become fitful and filled with dreams of medical emergencies and the faces of patients she couldn't save. Most telling of all is the way her body now responds to her pager's beep, not with the appropriate alertness of a medical professional, but with a full body tension that suggests her nervous system has forgotten the difference between genuine emergency and routine call. Her fight or flight response has become permanently activated, leaving her in a state of constant low-level alarm that her body was never designed to sustain. The Buddhist understanding of the body as teacher offers a different framework for interpreting these signals. Rather than viewing physical symptoms as obstacles to be overcome or weaknesses to be pushed through, this perspective sees the body as a wise messenger, constantly communicating information about the state of our whole being, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. The body doesn't lie, doesn't rationalize, doesn't tell us what we want to hear. It simply reports what is. Dr. Chen's body has been reporting for months that something is out of balance, that the system is running too hot, that reserves are dangerously low, But like many healers, she's fallen into the trap of believing that acknowledging her own needs would somehow betray her commitment to others. She's internalized the myth that caring for patients requires self-neglect, that being a good doctor means ignoring her own humanity. This myth is particularly insidious in healthcare, where the culture of endless availability and the reality of life and death. Responsibility can make any attention to personal needs feel selfish or unprofessional. But what Dr. Chen is beginning to understand, sitting in the quiet of her car with nowhere to rush and no one to save, is that her increasing exhaustion isn't just affecting her patients too. Yesterday, she found herself snapping at a nurse over a minor miscommunication, her irritability spilling out in a way that would have been unthinkable when she was well rested and emotionally resourced. Last week, she missed a subtle change in a patient's condition that she would normally catch immediately, her depleted attention creating a blind spot that could have had serious consequences. Her exhaustion isn't just a personal problem, it's a patient safety issue, a professional responsibility disguised as personal neglect. The recognition hits her like a diagnosis suddenly becoming clear. She isn't protecting her patients by ignoring her own needs. She's potentially endangering them. A surgeon wouldn't operate with trembling hands from hypoglycemia. An emergency physician shouldn't make critical decisions while running on emotional and physical empty. The very compassion that drives her to ignore her own signals is undermining her ability to provide the quality of care her patients deserve. Dr. Chen closes her eyes and takes her first conscious breath of the day, allowing air to move fully into her lungs, rather than the shallow breathing that has become her norm. As she breathes, she begins to listen to her body with the same careful attention she brings to her patient's symptoms. What is it trying to tell her? What information has she been ignoring? The fatigue, she realizes, isn't just tiredness. It's a profound depletion that speaks to months of giving more than she was taking in. The headaches aren't just tension. They're the physical manifestation of a mind that never fully rests, even during sleep. The inability to transition from work to home isn't just dedication, it's a nervous system that has forgotten how to downshift, stuck in overdrive even when the emergency is over. But beneath the exhaustion and tension, as she sits quietly with her breath, Dr. Chen notices something else, a deep longing that she's been too busy to acknowledge. It's a yearning for the simple pleasure of eating a meal without thinking about medical charts, for taking a shower without her mind racing through tomorrow's cases, for having a conversation that isn't about symptoms and treatment plans. This longing isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's her being calling her back to wholeness, reminding her that she is more than her professional role, that her worth doesn't depend entirely on her usefulness to others, that caring for herself isn't selfish indulgence, but necessary maintenance of the instrument through which her compassion flows. The parking lot is quiet, except for the distant sound of ambulance sirens, sound that usually triggers immediate tension in her body. Tonight, for the first time in months, she hears it without automatically calculating whether she might be called in, whether someone needs her, whether her rest might be interrupted. Tonight, she allows herself to trust that her colleagues can handle whatever arrives, that the hospital will function without her constant vigilance, that taking care of herself is not abandonment of her calling, but honoring of it. Dr. Chen finally turns off her phone, not permanently, not irresponsibly, but for the next 8 hours. She walks slowly to her apartment, feeling each step on the cold pavement, noticing the way her breath forms small clouds in the winter air. Instead of immediately checking medical journals or reviewing tomorrow's schedule, she runs a bath, makes a cup of herbal tea, and sits by her window watching snow fall on the quiet street below. What signals has your body been sending that you've been too busy to receive? What symptoms have you been treating as obstacles rather than information? These questions aren't meant to create more self-criticism, but to reopen the conversation between your conscious mind and your body's wisdom. As the night deepens around her apartment, Dr. Chen practices something revolutionary, doing nothing productive. She doesn't read medical literature, doesn't answer emails, doesn't plan tomorrow's tasks. She simply sits with her tea and her breath, and the recognition that listening to her body's language of exhaustion isn't giving up on healing others. It's the first step toward healing the healer, the essential foundation that makes all other healing possible. Margaret stands at her kitchen sink in Eugene, Oregon, washing the same plate for the 3rd time, her hands moving in mechanical circles, while her mind struggles to process what her neighbor just offered. "Let me bring you dinner tonight," Helen had said, standing on Margaret's front porch, with snow melting off her boots and genuine concern etched in the lines around her eyes. "You've been taking care of everyone since David's diagnosis. It's time someone took care of you." The plate slips from Margaret's soapy hands and clatters against the stainless steel basin. For 43 years, Margaret has been the one who brings casseroles to grieving families, who organizes meal trains for new mothers, who shows up without being asked when crisis strikes a neighbor's household. She is the helper, the giver, the one people call when they need something done. The idea of being on the receiving end of such care feels foreign, almost frightening, like putting on someone else's clothes that don't quite fit. The art of receiving grace requires a profound shift in identity, a willingness to step down from the pedestal of perpetual competence and join the vulnerable ranks of humanity where everyone needs help sometimes. For those of us who have built our sense of worth around being useful, being needed, being the strong one others can lean on, accepting help can feel like admitting failure rather than embracing our shared human condition. Margaret's resistance to Helen's offer runs deeper than simple politeness or independence. It touches something fundamental about how she sees herself and her place in the world. To accept help means acknowledging that she has needs, limitations, moments of weakness that require support from others. It means admitting that the careful architecture of competence she's built over decades has cracks in it, places where the foundation has shifted under the weight of her husband's illness and her own accumulated exhaustion. David's Parkinson's diagnosis 6 months ago changed everything. Though Margaret has worked hard to maintain the illusion that nothing has changed at all, she still volunteers at the community center, still bakes pies for church fundraisers, still hosts family dinners every Sunday. But now these activities are layered on top of a new reality monitoring David's medications, helping him dress when his tremors are severe, lying awake at night listening to his breathing and worrying about what tomorrow might bring. The person Margaret has always been capable, organized, endlessly giving now, coexists with someone she doesn't quite recognize, tired, overwhelmed, occasionally resentful of the way her life has narrowed to fit around David's needs. This new version of herself terrifies her more than David's diagnosis, because it reveals the fiction she's been living, that she was somehow above the ordinary struggles that required other people's help, that she was the helper but never the helped. Consider the metaphor of the river that has always flowed in one direction, carrying nutrients from the mountains to the valley, nourishing everything in its path. The river knows itself by its giving, defines its purpose by its capacity to sustain other life. But what happens when drought comes, when the river's own sources begin to dwindle? Does the river have the wisdom to receive rain when it falls, to accept the tributaries that offer to replenish its flow? Or does it resist, clinging to its identity as giver even as it slowly runs dry? Margaret discovers the answer to this question on a Tuesday evening when she finds herself sitting on her bathroom floor, crying with a depth of exhaustion she hasn't allowed herself to feel in months. David is having a particularly difficult day, his movements increasingly unpredictable, his frustration with his own body spilling over into short-tempered exchanges that leave them both depleted. Margaret has just spent 20 minutes helping him with a task that used to take 30 seconds, and something in her finally breaks, not with anger or resentment, but with the simple recognition that she cannot do this alone. The phone call to Helen requires more courage than Margaret realized she possessed. About that dinner offer, she begins, her voice smaller than usual. If it's still available, I think I'd like to accept. The relief in Helen's voice is immediate and profound. Oh, Margaret, I'm so glad. I've been wanting to help but wasn't sure how. I'll be over at 6 with lasagna and salad. When Helen arrives that evening, she doesn't just bring food. She brings the gift of seeing Margaret as she truly is. Not as the perfect helper she's always pretended to be, but as a woman doing her best under difficult circumstances. Helen doesn't comment on the dishes in the sink or the laundry basket overflowing in the living room. She doesn't offer advice about managing David's care or suggest support groups Margaret should join. She simply sets the table, serves the meal, and listens as Margaret finally allows herself to speak truthfully about how hard everything has become. The conversation that unfolds over Helen's lasagna reveals something. Margaret hadn't expected that receiving help doesn't diminish her, but somehow makes her more real, more present, more genuinely connected to the people around her. When she stops performing competence and starts admitting struggle, Helen responds, not with judgment or pity, but with recognition. I went through something similar when my mother was dying, Helen shares. I thought I had to handle everything myself. It nearly killed me. This is the paradox of receiving grace. It connects us more deeply to our common humanity, rather than separating us through shame. When we allow others to see our needs and respond to them, we create space for authentic relationship, rather than the one-sided connections that form around helper and helped. Margaret realizes that her years of giving to others, while genuinely generous, had also been a way of maintaining distance, of staying safely on the side of strength, rather than risking the vulnerability of mutual interdependence. Over the following weeks, Margaret begins practicing the radical art of accepting help. When her daughter offers to take David to his doctor's appointment, Margaret says yes, instead of insisting she can handle it. When her church circle organizes a meal schedule, she allows herself to be added to the recipient list rather than just the contributor list. When her neighbor's teenage son offers to shovel her driveway after snowstorms, she accepts gracefully rather than rushing outside to do it herself. Each act of receiving feels like learning a new language, one that requires her to trust in the fundamental goodness of people and the interconnected nature of community life. She discovers that people want to help, not because they pity her, but because helping feels good, because being needed feels meaningful, because caring for others is how many people express their love. Most surprisingly, Margaret finds that accepting help doesn't make her weaker, makes her more generous. When she stops trying to be superhuman, she has more authentic compassion for others who are struggling. When she acknowledges her own limitations, she can offer support without the underlying judgment that comes from believing struggle is a choice or a failure. When she receives care gracefully, she models for others that needing help is part of the human experience, not a sign of inadequacy. The shift is visible in her interactions with David as well. Instead of approaching his care with the grim determination of someone who must handle everything alone, she begins to see it as something they navigate together, along with their community of support. She stops trying to hide his condition from friends and family, stops pretending that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. This honesty creates space for others to offer specific, meaningful help, rather than the vague, "let me know if you need anything," that people offer when they sense struggle but aren't given permission to address it directly. Margaret's garden, which she had let go during the months when caring for David consumed all her available energy, becomes a metaphor for her new understanding of receiving. In spring, instead of trying to restore it single-handedly, she accepts Helen's offer to help with the heavy work and her daughter's gift of new plants. The result is more beautiful than anything she could have created alone, not because the individual contributors are more skilled than she is, but because the garden becomes a collaboration, a shared creation that reflects the love and attention of multiple hands and hearts. What would it feel like to let someone take care of you today? What help have you been refusing out of pride, fear, or the mistaken belief that accepting support diminishes your strength? These questions aren't meant to shame your independence, but to invite you into the fuller experience of community, where giving and receiving flow in natural cycles like breath itself. As summer evening light filters through Margaret's kitchen window, she sits at her table sharing a meal that Helen cooked, served on plates that her daughter washed, in a house where David rests comfortably after an appointment that their neighbor drove him to. The scene would have felt like failure to the Margaret of a year ago. To the Margaret of today, it feels like grace, the recognition that we are all held by invisible networks of care, that our strength lies not in our self-sufficiency, but in our willingness to be part of the great web of mutual support that makes community possible. The emergency room at Providence Hospital in Portland runs on the unspoken assumption that its staff are somehow immune to the very conditions they treat daily. Dr. James Moreau has spent 12 years moving through these bright, sterile corridors with the quiet confidence of someone who fixes others while remaining mysteriously whole himself. But tonight, as he sits in his small office reviewing charts at 2 a.m., something shifts. The tremor in his hands, which he's been attributing to too much coffee for months, won't stop. And for the first time in his career, he recognizes his own symptoms in the diagnostic manual he's memorized by heart. The revelation comes not as dramatic collapse, but as quiet recognition. The way dawn doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but simply makes visible what was always there. James looks at his shaking hands and sees anxiety, chronic stress, the early stages of the burnout he's helped diagnose in countless colleagues, while somehow believing himself exempt from such human frailties. The helper, it turns out, needs healing. This recognition pierces through one of the most persistent myths in caregiving professions, the belief that those who dedicate their lives to healing others somehow transcend their own need for care. Doctors, nurses, therapists, social workers, teachers, and spiritual leaders often operate under this invisible assumption that their calling protects them from the very struggles they witness and treat in others. It's as if the act of helping creates a magical barrier between the helper and the helped, making the healer somehow immune to the conditions of being human. But bodies don't recognize professional boundaries. Stress hormones don't pause their effects because someone wears a white coat or carries a counseling license. Depression doesn't skip over those who treat depression. Addiction doesn't avoid those who work in recovery centers. The helper's wounds may be hidden behind competence and compassion, but they exist with the same insistence and urgency as anyone else's pain. James traces the beginning of his current crisis to a seemingly minor incident 3 months ago. A young patient came into the emergency room after a suicide attempt, and something about her, age 26, the same age as James's daughter, broke through his usual professional boundaries. He found himself staying late to check on her progress, calling the psychiatric unit more frequently than necessary, lying awake at night imagining the despair that could drive someone so young to such desperate action. That case opened a floodgate James didn't know existed. Suddenly, every trauma he'd witnessed over 12 years of emergency medicine seemed present in his consciousness simultaneously. The car accidents, the overdoses, the domestic violence cases, the children who came in with injuries that spoke of unthinkable neglect, all of it pressed against his awareness like water against a dam that had developed invisible cracks. The cumulative weight of untended sorrow reveals itself in unexpected ways. James finds himself crying during television commercials, overwhelmed by the ordinary sadness of life insurance ads and pharmaceutical testimonials. He snaps at his wife over trivial household matters, then feels flooded with guilt at his irritability. Sleep becomes elusive, filled with dreams of patients he couldn't save and scenarios he couldn't control. The hypervigilance that serves him well in medical emergencies begins operating around the clock, leaving him constantly alert to dangers, both real and imagined. Most telling is the way he begins to avoid his own medical care. When his annual physical comes due, he reschedules twice, then postpones indefinitely. When the tremor in his hands becomes noticeable to colleagues, he makes excuses about caffeine intake and poor sleep rather than seeking evaluation. The physician who encourages patients to prioritize their health finds himself unable to follow his own advice, trapped in the paradox of being simultaneously expert in healing and resistant to being healed. This resistance runs deeper than simple denial or professional pride. It touches the core identity that many helpers construct around being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who has answers rather than questions, solutions rather than problems. To admit to needing help feels like admitting to fundamental fraud, as if the years of effective service become somehow invalidated by the revelation of personal struggle. James's breakthrough comes through an unlikely source, a conversation with Mrs. Chen. an elderly patient who comes to the emergency room with chest pain that turns out to be anxiety rather than cardiac distress. As he explains her diagnosis and discharge instructions, she looks at him with the clear-eyed wisdom of someone who has lived long enough to recognize suffering in all its disguises. "Doctor," she says gently, "you look tired. Not just sleepy tired, but heart tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" The question, asked with such simple directness, bypasses all his professional defenses. For a moment, James sees himself through her eyes, not as the competent physician, but as a person carrying more than he can hold. Someone in need of the same compassion he offers patients daily. "I'm fine," he responds automatically, the phrase so practiced it emerges without conscious thought. But Mrs. Chun's expression doesn't change, and in her continued attention, James feels something he hasn't experienced in years: being truly seen. Not seen as a role or a function, but seen as a human being whose well-being matters independent of his usefulness to others. That night, for the first time since medical school, James makes a doctor's appointment for himself. Not for the tremor, though he'll mention that too, but for what he now recognizes as depression, the same condition he's helped diagnose in hundreds of patients. Now presenting in his own life with textbook clarity, the irony isn't lost on him that he can recognize every symptom of burnout, anxiety, and depression in others, while somehow missing the same signs in himself. The appointment itself becomes an exercise in role reversal that's both humbling and healing. Sitting on the examination table in a hospital gown, James experiences vulnerability from the other side, the slight anxiety of waiting for results, the relief of having someone else take responsibility for his care, the strange comfort of being the patient rather than the provider. Dr. Martinez, his longtime colleague who's now treating him, approaches the consultation with the same careful attention James brings to his own patients. But seeing it from the receiving end gives James new appreciation for the healing power of simply being heard. The diagnosis is what James expected: major depression, anxiety disorder, occupational burnout. The treatment plan includes therapy, medication, and temporary reduction in work hours. But the most healing part of the process isn't the prescription or the referrals, it's the normalization of his experience. The recognition that struggling doesn't disqualify him from being an effective healer, but might actually deepen his capacity for compassion. Dr. Martinez shares something that surprises James. 60% of emergency physicians experience symptoms of depression or anxiety during their careers. The surprising thing isn't that you're struggling, it's that you're finally addressing it. Most of us just push through until we crash completely. This statistic, which James would have found alarming if applied to any other profession, brings unexpected relief when applied to his own situation. He's not failing at being a doctor, he's having a normal human response to extraordinary circumstances. The path forward isn't about fixing himself quickly and returning to previous levels of activity. It's about learning to integrate his own humanity into his professional identity, recognizing that his wounds don't disqualify him from healing others, but might actually enhance his ability to connect with patients who are also struggling with conditions beyond their control. James begins attending a support group for healthcare workers, a decision that initially feels like professional suicide, but gradually becomes one of the most valuable parts of his week. Sitting in a circle with nurses, therapists, and other doctors who are also learning to tend their own wounds creates a sense of community he didn't know he was missing. These conversations normalize the experience of helping professionals who need help, creating space for the truth that caring for others often requires learning to care for ourselves. The tremor in his hands gradually subsides with treatment. But more importantly, James develops a different relationship with his own vulnerability. Instead of seeing his struggles as evidence of weakness or professional inadequacy, he begins to understand them as the natural result of years of witnessing human suffering without adequately tending his own emotional well-being. The helper needing healing isn't a contradiction, it's a completion. A recognition of the full circle of care that includes everyone, even those whose job it is to provide care to others. What wounds have you been tending in others while ignoring in yourself? What healing do you need that you've been postponing, denying, or minimizing? These questions aren't meant to create additional guilt, but to extend the circle of compassion wide enough to include your own experience. As winter deepens in Portland, James returns to work with reduced hours and increased self-awareness. He's the same skilled physician, but now he brings to his practice the hard-earned wisdom of someone who has been patient as well as provider, who has experienced the vulnerability of needing help and the relief of receiving it. The helper who has been healed doesn't lose their capacity to heal others. They gain access to depths of empathy and understanding that only come through walking on both sides of the healing relationship. The tea kettle whistles in Anna's kitchen in Missoula, Montana, its high note cutting through the pre-dawn quiet like a meditation bell calling her back to awareness. She's been standing at the counter for several minutes, lost in the familiar mental rehearsal of her day-to-client sessions, the committee meeting, the phone calls to return, the presentation to prepare. Even in these moments meant for stillness, her mind churns with the endless inventory of ways she might be useful, productive, necessary. But as she pours hot water over chamomile flowers, something different emerges in the steam that rises from her cuppa. Question she's been avoiding for months. What if she could learn to pour herself back into her own vessel as carefully as she tends to everyone else's needs? The rhythm of pour and pause governs all natural systems, from the tides that retreat to gather strength for their return, to the heart that rests between beats to sustain its endless circulation of life. Yet somewhere in her journey from idealistic young counselor to seasoned therapist, Anna has lost touch with this fundamental pattern. She has become a river that only flows outward, forgetting that even the most generous waterways must return to their source to continue their giving. This morning, cradled in the silence before her household awakens, Anna begins to recognize the wisdom embedded in cycles, how the moon waxes and wanes without apologizing for its dark phases, how trees shed their leaves, not from failure, but from trust in the regenerative power of dormancy, how even the sun sets each evening not to abandon the earth but to illuminate other horizons before returning with renewed radiance. The metaphor of breathing offers perhaps the clearest teaching about the necessity of rhythmic giving and receiving. Every exhale, no matter how generous or life-sustaining to the plants around us, must be followed by an inhale. The pause between breaths isn't empty space, but the essential moment of turning. the pivot point where releasing transforms into receiving. Without this rhythm, without the willingness to draw in what we need as readily as we offer what we have, even breathing becomes impossible. Anna's awakening to her own depleted state came through her work with Alina, a client who had been caring for her disabled son for 15 years without respite. "I don't know how to stop," Alina had confessed during their session the previous week, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has forgotten that rest is possible. "I'm afraid that if I pause, even for a moment, everything will fall apart." Anna had offered Alina gentle guidance about the importance of sustainable caregiving, the necessity of refilling one's own well. But sitting in her kitchen now, Anna recognizes that she's been giving advice she doesn't follow, wisdom she hasn't integrated into her own life. The recognition arrives not as judgment, but as invitation, an opportunity to explore what it might mean to practice the rhythm of pour and pause in her own experience. Anna sets her tea aside and walks to her bedroom window, where the first hints of dawn are beginning to paint the Bitterroot Mountains in shades of rose and gold. Outside, she can see the natural world demonstrating the very principles she struggles to embody. The way the landscape holds both the active energy of growing things and the receptive stillness of spaces between. The dynamic balance of effort and ease that makes sustainable life possible. The Buddhist concept of the middle way suddenly takes on new meaning as Anna stands at her window. She has been living at one extreme: constant outpouring, endless availability, perpetual motion in service to others. The middle way isn't about finding some lukewarm compromise between caring and not caring, but about discovering the dynamic balance that allows for both generous giving and conscious receiving, both active service and restorative rest. Anna decides to conduct an experiment with herself, a gentle exploration of what sustainable rhythm might look like in her daily life. Instead of checking her phone immediately upon waking, her usual habit that plunges her into other people's needs before she's even fully present to her own, she commits to spending the first 30 minutes of each day in what she begins to think of as receptive mode, not actively doing anything productive, but simply allowing herself to receive whatever the morning offers: the quality of light, the taste of her tea, the sensation of her body emerging from sleep. This simple practice reveals how foreign the concept of receiving has become to her. In those first minutes of attempted receptivity, her mind generates an endless stream of tasks she could be completing, people she should be helping, problems she might be solving. The addiction to productivity runs so deep that pure being feels almost intolerable, like withdrawal from a drug she didn't realize she was dependent on. But gradually, as Anna persists with her morning practice, something begins to shift. The quality of her attention changes from the scattered, reactive awareness of someone always ready to respond to demands, to a more centered, spacious presence that can hold whatever arises without immediately trying to fix, improve, or organize it. She discovers that this receptive state isn't passive or lazy, it's actively restorative. A deliberate choice to allow her nervous system to settle into a different rhythm than the chronic low-level activation that has become her norm. The effects of this practice ripple out into her professional life in unexpected ways. During client sessions, Anna finds herself less hurried, more present, able to listen with deeper attention because she's not simultaneously managing her own depleted state. Her responses come from a place of greater spaciousness, rather than the slight desperation of someone trying to be helpful while running on empty. Clients begin commenting on a quality in her presence that they haven't experienced before. Kind of settled attention that makes them feel more seen and heard. Anna realizes that her previous approach to therapy, while competent and caring, had been subtly contaminated by her own need to feel useful and effective. When she was depleted, helping others had become a way of avoiding her own inner state, a form of spiritual bypassing disguised as professional dedication. Now, approaching her work from a more balanced place, she can offer genuine presence rather than performed caring, authentic wisdom rather than recycled advice. The practice extends beyond her morning routine into the structure of her entire day. Anna begins to notice the natural rhythms already embedded in her schedule and how she's been ignoring them. The brief walk between her office and the parking garage becomes an opportunity for pause rather than mental rehearsal of her next appointment. Lunch transforms from fuel hastily consumed while reviewing notes into actual nourishment. A midday practice of receiving sustenance, both physical and spiritual. Most significantly, Anna begins to honor the transition times, those liminal spaces between one activity and another that she's always rushed through in her urgency to be productive. The few minutes between client sessions become micro-retreats, opportunities to settle back into her center, rather than carrying the energy of one interaction into the next. The drive home from work becomes a ritual of transition from professional helper to private person, a conscious shifting of gears that allows her to arrive at her front door as herself rather than as an extension of her roles and responsibilities. The resistance to this new rhythm comes not from external pressures, but from internal voices that question the productivity and value of rest. Anna finds herself negotiating with parts of her psyche that have been trained to equate worth with constant motion, that fear being judged as lazy or self-indulgent if she's not perpetually useful to others. These voices are strong and persistent, backed by years of conditioning and cultural messaging about the virtue of self-sacrifice. But Anna has allies in this internal negotiation, the evidence of her own increasing effectiveness. The feedback from clients who respond to her more grounded presence, the simple physical reality that she has more energy and creativity to offer when she's not operating from depletion. The proof, she discovers, is in the living. The rhythm of pour and pause doesn't diminish her capacity to serve it, enhances it, providing the sustainable foundation that makes long-term caregiving possible. As winter deepens in Montana, Anna's practice evolves into something more sophisticated than simple time management. She begins to sense the natural rhythms within each day, each week, each season, learning to align her energy with these larger cycles rather than forcing herself to maintain constant output regardless of internal or external conditions. Some days call for generous pouring forth, others invite deep receptivity. Some seasons support intensive service, others require fallow time for regeneration. What rhythm does your own life want to find? Where have you been forcing constant output without allowing for the natural pauses that make sustainability possible? These questions aren't invitations to selfishness, but to the kind of self-awareness that makes authentic service possible over the long term. The tea in Anna's cup has long since grown cold, but she drinks it anyway, tasting the bitter wisdom of chamomile that has been allowed to steep fully in hot water before offering its gifts. This, she thinks, might be the secret not to rush the steeping process, not to hurry the transformation that turns ordinary leaves into medicine, but to trust in the alchemy that occurs when we allow sufficient time for receiving before the next round of giving begins. The morning sun streams through the windows of Rebecca's home office in Boulder, Colorado, casting long shadows across the pile of thank you notes she's received from clients over the past 5 years. Each card represents a life touched, a crisis navigated, a moment when her skills as a family counselor made a real difference. Yet sitting here surrounded by evidence of her positive impact, Rebecca feels a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest, not because her work isn't meaningful, but because she can't shake the persistent whisper that she should be doing more, helping more people, solving more problems, being more available, more useful, more worthy of the trust others place in her. This is guilt's most insidious disguise, not the obvious shame of having done something wrong, but the subtle conviction that being generous isn't generous enough, that caring deeply isn't caring deeply enough, that serving others isn't serving enough others. It's the perfectionist version of compassion, where every yes to one person feels like a no to countless others who might also benefit from our attention, and every moment of rest carries the weight of imagined suffering we're not preventing by taking time for ourselves. Rebecca traces this particular form of guilt back to childhood, to growing up in a household where love felt conditional on usefulness. Her mother, overwhelmed by the demands of raising 4 children while managing her own mother's declining health, had little patience for ordinary childhood needs, but abundant praise for Rebecca when she helped with household tasks or entertained her younger siblings. The message, never spoken but deeply absorbed, was clear. Worth comes from service, love follows usefulness, and rest is a luxury earned only after everyone else's needs have been met. This childhood programming operates with surgical precision in adult life, turning every natural human need into evidence of selfishness. When Rebecca feels tired after a day of intense sessions, guilt whispers that dedicated therapists don't get tired. When she craves solitude after hours of holding space for others' emotions, shame suggests that truly compassionate people always want to be available. When she considers taking a vacation, an inner voice calculates how many clients could be helped with the time and money she's wasting on rest and renewal. The Buddhist understanding of guilt as a form of self-violence offers a different perspective on these internal accusations. Rather than seeing guilt as evidence of high moral standards, this tradition recognizes it as a form of suffering that often perpetuates the very problems it claims to address. Guilt about not serving enough doesn't increase our capacity to serve. It depletes the energy and clarity that make genuine service possible. Self-criticism doesn't purify our motives, contaminates them with anxiety and self-preoccupation. Rebecca's awakening to the destructive nature of her guilt begins during a meditation retreat, where she encounters the practice of metta, or loving-kindness meditation. The instructions seem simple. Offer phrases of goodwill first to yourself, then to loved ones, neutral people, difficult people, and finally, all beings everywhere. May I be happy, may I be healthy, may I live with ease, she repeats silently, but the words feel hollow, almost blasphemous. How can she wish ease for herself when so many people are suffering? How can she prioritize her own happiness when clients are struggling with depression, families are fragmenting, children are experiencing trauma? The resistance Rebecca encounters in offering herself basic kindness reveals the depth of her conditioning around worth and service. She can easily generate genuine compassion for her clients, warm feelings for strangers, even patience for difficult colleagues. But when it comes to extending the same tenderness toward herself, she hits a wall of judgment so solid it seems impenetrable. The voice that offers understanding to everyone else turns harsh and demanding when directed inward, insisting that she doesn't deserve the same compassion she freely gives to others. This double standard becomes impossible to ignore during a particularly challenging week when Rebecca finds herself counseling 3 families dealing with teenager suicide attempts. The sessions are emotionally intensive, requiring her to hold space for parents' terror, adolescents' despair, and siblings' confusion while maintaining the therapeutic presence that helps them navigate these dark waters. By Friday evening, Rebecca is emotionally and physically exhausted. But instead of recognizing this as a natural response to challenging work, she berates herself for not having more energy to take on additional clients, more creativity to offer better interventions, more stamina to extend her office hours. The breakthrough comes when Rebecca imagines one of her clients experiencing the same internal dialogue she subjects herself to daily. If Maria, a mother struggling with postpartum depression, came into sessions saying she felt guilty for needing rest after caring for her newborn, Rebecca would gently challenge that belief. If David, a teacher experiencing burnout, reported feeling shame for wanting time away from his students, she would help him examine the faulty thinking underlying that guilt. Yet somehow, the wisdom she offers clients doesn't apply to her own experience, or rather, she doesn't allow it to apply. The Buddhist teaching on the near enemy begins to make sense in a visceral way. The near enemy of compassion isn't cruelty, it's pity. The near enemy of loving kindness isn't hatred, it's conditional love. And the near enemy of service isn't selfishness, self-sacrifice that comes from guilt rather than genuine care. When Rebecca helps others from a place of guilt-driven compulsion, she's not offering pure compassion but a contaminated version that carries within it her own unresolved suffering around worth and acceptance. Rebecca begins practicing what she calls compassionate auditing, periodically checking the emotional quality of her service to see whether it's flowing from authentic care or from the anxious need to prove her goodness. She notices that when guilt is driving her actions, her presence with clients becomes slightly forced, her responses more formulaic, her attention partially distracted by self-monitoring. When she serves from genuine compassion, the kind that includes herself in its scope, her presence becomes more natural, her responses more spontaneous, her attention more fully available. The practice of releasing guilt isn't about becoming selfish or lowering her standards of care. It's about recognizing that guilt is a poor motivator for genuine service, that shame-based helping ultimately serves the helper's need for approval rather than the recipient's need for support. Rebecca begins to experiment with what it feels like to serve from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than deficit, from authentic compassion rather than performed virtue. This shift requires her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her helping patterns. When she's honest about her motivations, Rebecca recognizes that her compulsive availability has sometimes served her own need to feel important rather than others' need for support. Her difficulty saying no to requests has occasionally resulted in overcommitment that compromised the quality of care she could offer. Her guilt about taking breaks has sometimes led to fatigue-induced mistakes that affected her professional effectiveness. The most challenging aspect of releasing guilt is learning to tolerate the discomfort of imperfection. Rebecca has to practice accepting that she cannot help everyone who needs help, cannot solve every problem she encounters, cannot be available to every person who might benefit from her skills. This acceptance doesn't come from hard-heartedness, but from the recognition that attempting to do the impossible serves no one well. The surgeon who tries to operate on every patient simultaneously helps no one. The therapist who tries to be everything to everyone offers diluted presence to all. Rebecca begins setting what she calls guilt, boundaries, limits, designed not to protect her from work, but to protect her work from the contamination of guilt-driven helping. She establishes clear office hours and sticks to them, recognizing that her availability during specific times allows her to be fully present rather than resentfully available. She schedules regular supervision to process the emotional impact of her work, understanding that tending her own professional development ultimately serves her clients' welfare. She takes actual lunch breaks, not from selfishness, but from the recognition that sustainable helping requires sustainable helpers. The most surprising discovery in this process is how much more she enjoys her work when guilt isn't driving it. When Rebecca shows up for sessions because she's choosing to be there, rather than because she has to be there, her engagement becomes more authentic, her creativity more accessible, her stamina more reliable. The quality of her presence improves when it's not filtered through anxiety about whether she's doing enough, being enough, serving enough people in enough ways. What guilt have you been carrying that masquerades as virtue but actually diminishes your capacity to serve? What shame about your human limitations keeps you trapped in patterns of compulsive helping that serve no one well? These questions aren't invitations to self-indulgence, but to the kind of honest self-examination that makes authentic service possible. As the afternoon light shifts in Rebecca's office, she realizes that releasing guilt isn't about caring less, it's about caring more effectively. The generous heart that has been imprisoned by shoulds and shouldn'ts can finally breathe freely, offering its gifts not from desperation but from genuine abundance, not from the need to prove worthiness but from the simple joy of contributing to the well-being of others. This is service liberated from guilt, not perfect but authentic, not unlimited but sustainable, not driven by shame but drawn by love. The phone rings at 7:23 p.m. on a Thursday evening as Dr. Patricia Williams sits in her living room in Asheville, North Carolina, finally allowing herself to sink into the couch cushions after a 12-hour day at the community health clinic. The caller ID shows the number of her colleague Mark, and Patricia knows, without answering, that he's calling to ask if she can cover his weekend shift again. Her finger hovers over the answer button as two voices war within her. The familiar one that says good doctors never turn down opportunities to help, and a newer, quieter voice that whispers something radical about the difference between being useful and being used. For 15 years, Patricia has built her professional identity around being the reliable one. The doctor who says yes when others say no. The colleague who steps in during emergencies and stays late when cases run long. This identity has served her well in many ways, earning respect from peers, gratitude from patients, and a reputation as someone dedicated to healing above all else. But lately, she's begun to question whether all the helping she does actually stems from authentic calling or from something more complex, confusion between genuine service and the compulsive need to be needed. The distinction between true service and people-pleasing, disguised as virtue, is often invisible from the inside, woven so seamlessly into our self-concept that questioning it feels like questioning our fundamental goodness. True service flows from a centered place of choice, emerging naturally from our gifts and responding to genuine need. People-pleasing, even when dressed in the noble clothes of helping others, operates from anxiety, driven by the fear of disappointing others, losing approval, or confronting our own sense of unworthiness without the buffer of constant usefulness. Patricia sets the phone aside without answering, allowing it to ring until voicemail takes over. In the quiet that follows, she begins to examine the automatic yes that nearly escaped her lips, the way her body tensed with familiar anxiety at the thought of declining a request for help. This pause, this small space between stimulus and response, opens a window into patterns she's never questioned, revealing the difference between responding to authentic calling and reacting to conditioned programming. Consider the metaphor of the garden hose that appears to be generously watering many plants but has lost the ability to regulate its own flow. Water pours constantly from every small hole and tear, creating the appearance of abundant giving, while actually draining the system of the pressure needed to nourish specific areas when they truly need attention. The hose doesn't choose where to direct its water, it simply leaks everywhere, unable to distinguish between genuine need and the mere presence of dry ground. This is what Patricia begins to recognize in her own helping patterns. Her yes comes so automatically that it bypasses the discernment that would allow her to respond appropriately to different situations. The family emergency that requires her immediate attention receives the same reflexive agreement as the colleague who wants her to take on extra work because he prefers to play golf on weekends. The patient who needs her specific expertise gets the same automatic availability as the committee that needs someone to organize their holiday party. The Buddhist concept of right livelihood offers guidance for this confusion, suggesting that authentic work emerges from the intersection of our genuine gifts, the world's real needs, and our own sustainable capacity. When any one of these elements is missing, when we're working outside our gifts, responding to manufactured rather than genuine needs, or operating beyond our sustainable capacity, the work becomes a form of suffering rather than service, depleting rather than fulfilling us. Patricia begins practicing what she calls discernment meditation, taking time before responding to requests to feel into the quality of her motivation. When Mark calls the next day asking again about the weekend shift, instead of answering immediately, she tells him she'll call back in an hour. She sits quietly, breathing deeply, and asks herself several questions. Is this request within my actual expertise, or could someone else handle it equally well? Is the need genuine and urgent, or is it simply convenient for the person asking? Do I want to say yes from a place of authentic generosity, or am I afraid of what will happen if I say no? The answers that emerge surprise her. Mark's request, she realizes, isn't about patient care. His regular weekend physician is available, and the clinic is fully staffed. He simply prefers not to work weekends and knows Patricia rarely refuses requests for help. Her initial impulse to say yes comes not from medical necessity, but from the familiar anxiety of potentially disappointing a colleague. The fear that refusing might damage her reputation as someone who can always be counted on. When Patricia calls Mark back, she experiences something she hasn't felt in years: the power of authentic choice. "I'm not available this weekend," she says, simply, without elaborate justification or apology. Mark's response reveals the dynamic she's been unconsciously enabling: mild irritation followed by immediate transition to asking someone else. The request wasn't really about her being uniquely qualified. It was about her being predictably available. This experience opens Patricia's eyes to how many of her helping activities fall into the category of convenience rather than calling. The committees she serves on, the extra shifts she covers, the projects she takes on, how many of these represent genuine service versus enabling others to avoid their own responsibilities? How much of her identity as a helpful person rests on being useful to others in ways that don't actually require her specific gifts or contribute to any larger purpose? The practice of discernment extends beyond professional requests into Patricia's personal life, where the same patterns operate with different players. Her adult children have learned to call her whenever they need last-minute babysitting, financial help, or someone to listen to relationship problems. Her neighbors know she's the person to approach for help with everything from caring for pets during vacations to organizing block parties. Her church regularly asks her to coordinate events because she's never said no to previous requests. Patricia begins to recognize that her automatic availability, while well-intentioned, has sometimes prevented others from developing their own capacity to handle challenges, ask for help from appropriate sources, or simply tolerate temporary inconvenience. Her daughter Sarah, for instance, has never had to develop a reliable babysitting network because Patricia is always available in emergencies. Her neighbor Tom has never learned to plan ahead for pet care because he knows Patricia will step in when he needs last-minute help. The most difficult realization is that some of her helping has been motivated not by genuine care for others, but by her own need to feel important, needed essential to other people's well-being. There's a subtle form of control in always being the helper, maintains a certain position in relationships, where others become dependent on her generosity, while she remains safely in the role of giver rather than receiver, strong rather than vulnerable, helper rather than helped. True service, Patricia discovers, sometimes looks like stepping back rather than stepping in, saying no rather than yes, trusting others' capacity to handle challenges rather than rushing to smooth every difficulty. When her daughter calls in a panic because her regular babysitter cancelled last minute, instead of immediately offering to help, Patricia asks, "What other options are you considering?" This simple question opens space for Sarah to remember that she has other resources, friends who could help. a backup babysitter she'd forgotten about, the possibility of bringing her son along to the evening event she'd planned to attend. The shift from people-pleasing to authentic service requires Patricia to tolerate discomfort, both her own anxiety about potentially disappointing others, and others' temporary frustration when she's not immediately available to solve their problems. But what emerges from this discomfort is more genuine connection. When Patricia helps from choice rather than compulsion, her presence is more authentic, her assistance more thoughtful, her engagement more energetic. She begins to notice that people respond differently to her help when it comes from a centered place rather than anxious availability. Friends seem more appreciative when she chooses to assist with projects rather than automatically agreeing to them. Colleagues value her input more when she selectively engages with issues that match her expertise rather than saying yes to everything. Patients sense a difference in her presence when she's working from genuine calling rather than obligatory availability. Patricia's true service begins to emerge as she creates space around her decision-making. She discovers that her real gifts lie in complex diagnostic work and mentoring young physicians, areas where her experience and intuition make unique contributions. She begins saying yes more readily to opportunities that use these gifts and no more easily to requests that could be handled equally well by others. The practice of discernment becomes a form of prayer, a way of aligning her actions with deeper purpose rather than surface demands. Instead of asking, "How can I help?" she begins asking, "How is my help needed? What am I uniquely positioned to offer? What would genuine service look like in this situation? What requests have you been accepting from habit rather than calling? What helping patterns in your life serve others' convenience rather than genuine need?" These questions aren't meant to make you less generous, but to help you become more intentionally generous, offering your gifts where they can make the greatest difference rather than spreading them so thin that their impact is diluted. As evening settles over the mountains surrounding Asheville, Patricia sits in her garden, phone turned off, practicing the radical act of being unavailable for requests that don't align with her authentic service. This isn't selfishness, it's stewardship, the careful tending of her capacity to contribute meaningfully rather than merely constantly. In this spaciousness, her true calling has room to breathe, to emerge, to find its voice and offer its gifts to a world that needs not just more helpers, but more people who help from the clarity of genuine purpose. The word no sits in Dr. Sarah Coleman's throat like medicine she knows she needs to swallow but can't quite bring herself to take. Standing in the hallway of Seattle Children's Hospital, phone pressed to her ear, she listens to the familiar, pleading voice of Dr. Richardson from the emergency department asking if she can stay late again to cover for a colleague who called in sick. Her body screams exhaustion after a 14-hour shift. Her mind feels foggy from making life and death decisions without adequate rest. And somewhere deep in her chest, a small voice whispers that saying yes one more time might be the thing that finally breaks her. Yet the word that wants to emerge is still, somehow, yes. The medicine of saying no requires a complete reframing of refusal from act of selfishness to act of wisdom, from failure of compassion to expression of it, from abandonment of duty to fulfillment of a deeper responsibility to sustainable service. For those of us trained in perpetual availability, no feels like a foreign language, a betrayal of everything we believe about goodness, dedication, and love. But what if no could be as sacred as yes, as necessary as breathing out is to breathing in? Sarah's relationship with the word no has been complicated since childhood. Growing up in a family where love felt conditional on accommodation, where approval followed agreement, where saying no to requests meant risking the withdrawal of affection. Her mother, overwhelmed by the demands of raising 3 children while managing her own mother's care, had little patience for resistance, but abundant warmth for compliance. The unspoken family motto was clear: good people don't say no to those who need them. This conditioning operates with particular intensity in healthcare, where saying no can feel tantamount to abandoning patients, failing colleagues, or prioritizing personal comfort over professional duty. The culture of medicine reinforces these beliefs with stories of heroic physicians who sacrifice everything for their patients, who work beyond human limits, who never consider their own needs when lives are at stake. The hidden cost of this mythology is rarely discussed: the burnout rates, the suicide statistics, the family relationships destroyed by the impossible standard of perpetual availability. Consider the oxygen mask instruction that flight attendants give before every takeoff. Put your own mask on first before helping others. This isn't selfishness, it's survival physics. An unconscious person cannot assist anyone. Yet somehow, when applied to emotional and professional oxygen, this logic becomes controversial. The idea that we might need to preserve our own capacity in order to serve others effectively challenges the martyrdom model that pervades helping professions. Sarah's awakening to the necessity of no begins not with dramatic collapse, but with a series of small recognitions. During morning rounds, she finds herself struggling to remember basic patient details that would normally be easily accessible. Her usual warmth with families feels forced, performed rather than authentic. Her decision-making, typically sharp and intuitive, becomes labored and uncertain. These aren't signs of incompetence, they're symptoms of a system running beyond its sustainable capacity. The moment of clarity comes during a consultation with the family of 8-year-old Michael, who's been in the ICU for 3 weeks following a car accident. Sarah sits with Michael's parents, trying to explain his treatment options, but finds herself unable to access the emotional presence that such conversations require. She's offering medical facts from behind a wall of exhaustion, her usual empathy dulled by the chronic stress of never saying no to additional responsibilities. Later that evening, alone in the encore room, Sarah practices saying the word out loud, no. It feels strange in her mouth, almost violent, as if she's speaking a curse rather than setting a boundary. She tries different inflections, different contexts. No, I can't stay late tonight. No, I'm not available this weekend. No, I need to go home and rest. Each repetition makes the word feel slightly less foreign, slightly more possible. The Buddhist teaching on skillful means offers a framework for understanding no as a form of compassion rather than its opposite. Sometimes the most loving response is refusing to enable others, poor planning. Refusing to exhaust ourselves beyond effectiveness. Refusing to participate in systems that sacrifice helper well-being for the illusion of unlimited availability. Skillful no creates space for others to develop their own capacity, for systems to become more sustainable, for genuine emergencies to receive appropriate attention. Sarah's first intentional no comes the following week, when Dr. Richardson calls again with another request to cover an extra shift. Instead of the automatic yes that has been her pattern for years, Sarah takes a breath and says, "I'm not available tonight. Have you tried calling Dr. Martinez or Dr. Kim?" The silence on the other end is palpable. Dr. Richardson clearly expected the usual immediate agreement. "I really need someone with your experience," he responds, applying the familiar pressure of being told she's uniquely necessary. But Sarah has prepared for this moment, recognizing that others' poor planning doesn't constitute her emergency. "I understand you're in a difficult position," she replies with genuine empathy, "but I'm not able to help tonight. I trust you'll find a solution." The conversation ends more abruptly than usual, leaving Sarah with a mixture of anxiety and relief. The anxiety is familiar, the fear of having disappointed someone, of potentially being seen as unreliable or uncommitted. The relief is newer, the recognition that she has just reclaimed some sovereignty over her own time and energy. The practice of saying no requires developing tolerance for others' disappointment, frustration, or attempts at manipulation. Sarah discovers that many of the requests she's been automatically accepting come with emotional pressure designed to make refusal feel impossible. Colleagues frame their needs as urgent when they're merely convenient. Administrators invoke patient welfare when they're actually trying to avoid hiring adequate staff. Family members describe their requests as emergencies when they're often poor planning disguised as crisis. Learning to distinguish between genuine need and manufactured urgency becomes essential to practicing skillful no. When the hospital calls Sarah on her day off because a complex case has arrived that truly requires her specific expertise, she says yes from a place of authentic choice rather than compulsive availability. When a colleague asks her to cover a shift because he wants to attend a social event, she says no with equal clarity, recognizing that enabling this pattern doesn't serve anyone's long-term well-being. The most challenging aspect of practicing no is learning to tolerate the guilt that arises when she sets boundaries. Sarah's internal voices, shaped by years of conditioning, interpret every refusal as evidence of selfishness, laziness, or lack of dedication. These voices are particularly loud when she says no to requests that involve patient care, even when the requests are clearly about convenience rather than medical necessity. Sarah begins practicing what she calls guilt meditation, sitting quietly with the discomfort that follows saying no, breathing into the anxiety rather than trying to escape it, recognizing that the guilt is often disproportionate to the actual impact of her refusal. In most cases, when she says no, alternative solutions emerge quickly. Other physicians step forward, schedules get reorganized, or the supposed emergency turns out to be manageable with existing resources. The transformation in Sarah's professional relationships is gradual but profound. When she stops being automatically available, her presence when she chooses to help becomes more valued rather than taken for granted. Colleagues begin approaching her requests more thoughtfully, knowing they can't rely on her reflexive yes. The quality of her patient care improves when she's working from choice rather than exhaustion, bringing full attention and energy to cases rather than the diminished presence of someone operating beyond capacity. Most surprisingly, Sarah discovers that saying no to some things allows her to say yes more meaningfully to others. When she's not spread thin across multiple unnecessary commitments, she has energy available for the work that truly matches her gifts and serves genuine need. She begins volunteering for research projects that align with her interests, taking on mentoring relationships with residents, and developing new protocols that improve patient care contributions that were impossible when all her time was consumed by automatic availability. The medicine of saying no extends beyond professional life into personal relationships. Sarah begins declining social invitations when she needs solitude, saying no to family gatherings when she needs rest, refusing requests from friends that would stretch her beyond comfortable limits. Each no feels difficult initially, but creates space for more authentic engagement when she chooses to participate. Sarah's practice of intentional refusal becomes a form of prayer, a way of honoring the finite nature of human capacity, while maximizing the impact of whatever energy she has available. Instead of scattering her attention across endless requests, she concentrates it on areas where her unique gifts can make the greatest difference. The no becomes sacred not because it rejects connection, but because it protects the quality of connection. Not because it abandons service, but because it ensures that service comes from fullness rather than depletion. What would change in your life if you could say no with the same grace and conviction you bring to saying yes? What requests have you been accepting that drain your capacity without serving genuine need? These questions aren't invitations to selfishness, but to the kind of discernment that makes authentic generosity possible. As Sarah walks through the hospital corridors at the end of her shift, she carries herself differently, not with the exhausted resignation of someone trapped by others' needs, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned to steward her own capacity wisely. The medicine of no has taught her that boundaries aren't barriers to love, but the container that allows love to be offered sustainably, generously, authentically. In learning to refuse what doesn't serve, she has discovered the freedom to embrace what does. The morning mist rises from the small pond behind Elena's cottage in Vermont, creating ephemeral shapes that form and dissolve in the early light like thoughts in meditation. She sits on her weathered wooden porch, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that holds more than coffee. It holds the first quiet moment she's allowed herself in months. For years, Elena has tended everyone else's gardens while her own inner landscape grew wild with neglect, overrun by the urgent needs of others until she could barely remember what she had planted there in the first place. This morning marks a turning point, a decision she's been approaching like a shy animal carefully, tentatively, ready to bolt at the first sign of guilt or self-recrimination. Elena is going to spend the day tending her own garden, both literally and metaphorically, without apology, without justification, without the elaborate mental gymnastics she usually performs to make caring for herself seem somehow acceptable within her framework of perpetual service to others. The metaphor of the garden offers profound wisdom about the relationship between giving and receiving, output and renewal. Even the most generous fruit tree requires pruning, fertilizing, adequate water, and periods of dormancy to continue producing abundant harvests. A gardener who gives away every tomato, every flower, every herb, while never composting, never watering, never allowing fields to lie fallow, will eventually find themselves with barren ground and nothing left to offer. Elena's awakening to her own neglected inner landscape began 6 months ago when she realized she couldn't remember the last time she did something purely for her own enjoyment. Every activity in her life had become instrumentalized, exercise for better health, to serve others more effectively. Reading limited to materials that might help her be more useful in her work as a social worker. Even leisure time consumed by social obligations, disguised as relaxation. The recognition came during what was supposed to be a relaxing dinner with friends, where Elena found herself listening to Mary describe a weekend spent painting watercolors just for the joy of it. "I'm terrible at it," Mary laughed, "but I love the feeling of the brush moving across the paper, the way colors blend when they're still wet. I painted the same mountain 5 different ways yesterday, and each one taught me something new about seeing." Elena realized she couldn't remember the last time she had done anything simply for the pleasure of doing it, without any goal beyond the experience itself. Her life had become so thoroughly oriented toward utility. How can I help? What needs to be fixed? Who requires my attention, that she had lost touch with the simple human joy of engaging with the world without agenda. The Buddhist concept of beginner's mind suddenly took on personal meaning as Elena contemplated Mary's description of painting badly but joyfully. When had Elena last approached anything with beginner's mind? With curiosity rather than competence, with wonder rather than efficiency. When had she last allowed herself to be incompetent at something just for the sake of learning, growing, experiencing something new? That night, Elena walked through her actual garden, the one behind her cottage that she had planted years ago but barely maintained since her life became consumed with caring for others. In the twilight, she saw what neglect looked like. Overgrown flower beds where weeds had choked out the perennials. A vegetable patch that had reverted to wild grasses. Herb gardens where mint had overtaken everything else in its aggressive expansion. The garden's condition mirrored something Elena was beginning to recognize about her inner life. The parts of herself that weren't directly useful to others had been allowed to grow wild or die from lack of attention. Her creativity, once vibrant, had been crowded out by urgent demands. Her sense of play, her curiosity about subjects unrelated to work, her appreciation for beauty all had been sacrificed to the relentless focus on being helpful to others. Standing among the overgrown beds, Elena made a decision that felt both simple and revolutionary. She would reclaim Saturday mornings for gardening. Not community gardening, not helping elderly neighbors with their yards, not any form of gardening that served anyone else's needs. Just her hands in the soil, tending the small patch of earth that was hers to nurture without justification or external purpose. The first Saturday morning of this practice reveals how foreign the concept of purposeless activity has become. Elena kneels in the herb garden, pulling weeds with no greater goal than restoring the basil and oregano to sunlight. And her mind immediately begins generating reasons why this activity is valuable. Fresh herbs will improve her cooking. Gardening is good exercise. Time outdoors reduces stress, which will make her more effective at work. Even in this simple act of self-care, her conditioning tries to transform it into a form of indirect service to others. But as the morning progresses and Elena's hands find their rhythm in the familiar work of weeding, watering, and pruning, something deeper begins to emerge. The nervous energy that usually drives her helpful activities starts to settle. Her breathing slows and deepens. Her attention, typically scattered across multiple concerns about other people's needs, gathers into the present moment where there is only soil, plants, and the simple satisfaction of helping something grow. This is what Alina had been missing, the restorative power of purposeless engagement. The way working with her hands in her own garden feeds some essential part of her being that no amount of helping others could nourish. The garden doesn't need her help to prove she's a good person. It doesn't judge her worth by her productivity or measure her value by her usefulness. It simply receives whatever care she offers and responds with the quiet gratitude of growing things. The practice expands gradually, organically, like the plants Alina tends. Saturday morning gardening becomes Saturday morning plus evening walks around her property, just her and the changing light, no destination, no purpose beyond the pleasure of moving her body through space and observing the subtle shifts in season. The evening walks become occasional afternoon reading sessions on the porch, books chosen purely for enjoyment rather than professional development. Alina rediscovers parts of herself that had been dormant for years. She remembers her love of poetry, something that had flourished in college but been abandoned as impractical when she entered the helping professions. She begins keeping a small notebook in her garden apron, writing down phrases that capture her attention. The way morning light makes ordinary grass look holy. How silence sounds different when you're not waiting for someone to need you. The most surprising discovery is how tending her own garden affects her capacity to help others. When Alina returns to her work as a social worker, after Saturday mornings spent with her hands in soil, she finds herself more present, more creative, more genuinely available to her clients. The restorative time hasn't diminished, her compassionate has purified it, removing the subtle resentment that had been accumulating from years of giving without receiving, serving without being served. Her relationships with friends and family also shift as Alina becomes someone who has interests, needs, and experiences that exist independently of her role as helper. Instead of every conversation centering on other people's problems and her assistance with solving them, Alina begins sharing stories from her garden, reflections from her reading, observations from her walks. People respond to this more complete version of Alina with curiosity and engagement rather than just gratitude and need. The practice of tending her own garden teaches Alina about the seasons of the soul, how periods of intense giving must be balanced by periods of conscious receiving, how growth requires both effort and rest, how the most beautiful gardens include both cultivated areas and wild spaces left to develop according to their own wisdom. She begins to understand that caring for herself isn't selfish indulgence, but essential maintenance. Not time stolen from service to others, but the foundation that makes sustainable service possible. Just as her garden produces more abundant herbs when she tends it regularly rather than neglecting it for months and then working frantically to restore it. Her capacity for helping others increases when she maintains rather than depletes her inner resources. Alina's cottage garden becomes a living meditation on reciprocity, the way she feeds the soil and the soil feeds the plants, the way the plants feed her soul and her attention feeds their growth. This is the cycle she had been missing in her human relationships, the understanding that healthy giving and receiving flow in both directions. That sustainable helping requires helpers who are themselves helped, nourished, tended. As autumn deepens and Alina prepares her garden for winter, she reflects on what this season of returning to herself has taught her. The time spent pulling weeds from her herb garden has helped her identify which commitments in her life are nourishing and which are choking out her essential growth. The hours spent planting bulbs for spring have reminded her that some forms of care are investments in future flourishing rather than responses to immediate need. What aspects of yourself have you been neglecting while tending everyone else's needs? What would it mean to approach the care of your inner landscape with the same attention you bring to helping others? These questions aren't invitations to selfishness, but to the kind of self-stewardship that makes authentic service sustainable over time. The first frost arrives on a clear October morning, covering Elena's garden in crystalline beauty that transforms ordinary plants into works of art. She walks among the beds she has restored, noting which plants have thrived under her care and which need different approaches next season. The garden has taught her patience with herself, with natural cycles, with the slow work of transformation that can't be hurried but only tended with consistent, loving attention. In returning to her own garden, Alina has discovered something profound about the nature of service itself, that the helper who is helped becomes a better helper, that the giver who learns to receive offers gifts from fullness rather than depletion, that tending our own inner landscape isn't separate from serving others, but the essential foundation that makes such service authentic, sustainable, and truly beneficial to all. The snow falls softly outside Claire's window in a small town nestled in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. Each flake distinct yet part of something larger, settling into silence with the patient wisdom of winter itself. She sits in her favorite armchair, the one that has held her through countless evenings of reading other people's stories, planning other people's healing, carrying other people's burdens. Tonight, for the first time in years, Claire simply sits without agenda, without the weight of tasks undone or people unhelped, allowing herself to be exactly where she is without apology or explanation. This is the quiet revolution of self-care, not the loud proclamation of boundaries or the dramatic gesture of walking away from all responsibility, but the gentle, persistent choice to include oneself in the circle of beings worthy of compassion. It begins not with grand pronouncements, but with moments like this one, when the helper finally learns to help herself with the same tenderness she has always offered others. The path that led Claire to this chair, to this snowfall, to this moment of unhurried presence, has been neither straight nor simple. As a nurse practitioner in a rural clinic, she has spent 15 years being the person others turn to when their own resources feel insufficient. Patients seeking not just medical care but emotional support, colleagues needing coverage for their shifts, family members requiring assistance with everything from childcare to financial planning. Somewhere in the accumulation of yes after yes, Claire lost track of the quiet voice that had once guided her toward this work, the inner compass that could distinguish between authentic calling and compulsive helping. The revolution began 3 months ago with something as simple as a cup of tea. Claire had just finished a particularly demanding shift, 6 hours of back-to-back appointments followed by 2 hours of documentation, then a drive across town to help her elderly father with his grocery shopping. She arrived home exhausted, planning to quickly heat leftovers before reviewing patient charts for the next day. But when she opened her kitchen cabinet and saw the tin of chamomile tea her sister had given her for Christmas, unopened for 11 months, something inside her simply stopped. Instead of reheating dinner while standing at the counter and scrolling through emails, Claire did something revolutionary. She made tea with full attention. She heated water slowly, listening to its progression from silence to whisper to rolling boil. She measured the loose flowers carefully, breathing in their subtle fragrance. She set her kitchen timer for 5 minutes and waited, doing nothing but watching steam rise from the cup while the light faded outside her window. That 5-minute pause opened a space Claire had forgotten existed, a space between demand and response, between need and fulfillment, between other people's urgency and her own deep rhythm. In that space, she heard something she hadn't listened to in years, the sound of her own breathing, the rhythm of her own heartbeat, the quiet voice of her own wisdom, asking not what others needed from her, but what she needed for herself. The quiet revolution of self-care isn't about becoming less caring. It's about caring with greater wisdom, precision, and sustainability. It's about recognizing that the well from which we draw water for others must itself be tended, that the soil from which our generosity grows requires its own seasons of rest and renewal. Claire's revolution began with tea, but expanded into small acts of self-advocacy that felt enormous after years of automatic accommodation. She began saying no to the colleague who regularly asked her to cover weekend shifts, not because of genuine emergency, but because of poor planning. She started leaving her work phone in her car when she arrived home, creating a boundary between professional availability and personal rest. She scheduled her own medical appointments during work hours, rather than squeezing them into lunch breaks or days off. Recognizing that her health was not less important than her patient's convenience, each act of self-care felt like learning a new language, one that her culture had taught her was selfish, but her deeper wisdom recognized as essential. The Buddhist understanding of self-compassion offers a framework for this learning, that extending kindness to ourselves isn't narcissistic indulgence, but necessary practice, that treating ourselves with the same care we offer others isn't selfish but balanced, that our own well-being matters not because we're special, but because all beings' well-being matters. The most profound shift came when Claire began to understand that caring for herself wasn't separate from caring for others, but foundational to it. When she arrived at work, well-rested rather than exhausted, her presence with patients became more authentic, more spacious, more healing. When she took time for her own emotional processing rather than carrying the accumulated stress of weeks without pause, she could listen to patients' concerns with clearer attention and respond from genuine compassion rather than depleted obligation. The revolution deepened through practices so simple they felt almost silly at first. Claire began eating lunch away from her desk, sitting outside when weather permitted or in the clinic's small break room when it didn't, paying attention to the taste and texture of food rather than consuming fuel while reviewing charts. She started taking 3 conscious breaths before entering each patient's room, using those moments to center herself and arrive fully present rather than carrying the energy of the previous interaction. These micro-practices of self-care created ripples that extended far beyond Claire's personal experience. Patients began commenting on a quality in her presence they hadn't noticed before kind of settled. A tension that made them feel more seen and heard. Colleagues started asking what had changed, sensing something different in her energy, but unable to name it exactly. Family members noticed that she seemed more genuinely available when she chose to help rather than automatically agreeing to every request. The quiet revolution revealed itself most clearly during what had historically been Claire's most stressful time of year, the holiday season. When patient loads increased, family obligations multiplied, and the cultural pressure to give endlessly reached its annual peak. Instead of approaching December with the familiar dread of someone anticipating depletion, Claire made choices that honored both her desire to serve and her need for sustainability. She declined to organize the clinic's holiday party, recognizing that her yes would come from habit rather than enthusiasm. She limited her gift-giving to presents that brought her genuine joy to choose and give rather than obligations fulfilled from duty. She created new traditions for herself: Christmas morning walks in the snow, quiet evenings with books and tea, simple meals eaten slowly rather than elaborate preparations that exhausted her before the celebration began. The most surprising discovery in this revolution was how much more she enjoyed helping others when it came from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than depletion, from authentic care rather than performed virtue. When Claire said yes to requests because she genuinely wanted to contribute rather than because she couldn't figure out how to say no, her engagement became more creative, more energetic, more satisfying for everyone involved. As winter deepens around her mountain town, Claire practices what she has come to think of as sacred selfishness, the recognition that caring for herself is not separate from, but essential to, her capacity to care for others. This isn't the selfishness of taking more than one's share or ignoring others' legitimate needs, but the wise selfishness of a river that maintains its banks while flowing generously to the sea. The snow continues to fall outside her window, each flake finding its own way to ground, contributing to the larger accumulation of beauty and silence that winter brings to this landscape. Claire watches without agenda, drinking her tea slowly, breathing deeply into the spaciousness she has created, not by doing more, but by doing less, not by giving endlessly, but by giving wisely, not by abandoning care, but by expanding it to include herself. This is the quiet revolution's deepest teaching, that self-care is not the opposite of caring for others, but its foundation. That personal sustainability is not selfish, but essential to any meaningful service. That learning to help ourselves is perhaps the most important help we can offer to a world that needs not more burned out helpers, but more people who know how to sustain their capacity for genuine compassion over time. What would your own quiet revolution look like? What small acts of self-advocacy have you been postponing, thinking them less important than your service to others? The revolution begins not with dramatic gestures, but with moments like this one, pausing, breathing, including yourself in the circle of beings worthy of care and attention. As the evening settles into deeper quiet, Claire understands that she has not become less dedicated to helping others, but more skilled at helping sustainably. The quiet revolution of self-care has taught her that the helper who is helped becomes a better helper, that the giver who learns to receive offers gifts from abundance rather than depletion, that caring for ourselves is not betrayal of our calling to serve, but its truest expression. In this moment, surrounded by snow and silence, Claire embodies the profound truth that sometimes the most radical act of service is learning to rest. That sometimes the deepest compassion is the courage to care for ourselves with the same tenderness we offer others. That sometimes the quiet revolution of including ourselves in our own circle of care is the foundation upon which all other genuine service becomes possible.